you know what that sound means?
It's review time, and today we're going to review Tenet, directed by Christopher Nolan. So there's not a lot of new movies coming out lately, so it begs the question, is it worth risking infectious disease to go see this one? The short answer is no, not really. So what's Tenet about? The plot revolves around a secret agent who's sent on a mission to prevent the outbreak of World War III. In short, there's a bad guy with the doomsday device, and the good guys gotta stop him. Along the way, wacky science ensues, and that wacky science is called time inversion, which means objects and people can travel in reverse time. So it's kind of like time travel, but even more annoying and tedious. So the first thing that fell into question for me right away in this movie was the idea of suspension of disbelief. So I feel like there's two approaches to this. There's the one approach where the movie is, fantasy or science fiction, and it has its own rules, but it kind of has to stick to them. And two is the more grounded and realistic approach where it tries to use realistic science and, make things a little more like real life. This movie kind of seemed like it wanted to take the realistic approach, except for the rules of time travel are already so paradoxical and rarely make any sense. So this was just even worse because of reverse time, or whatever the hell they're called. Time inversion. Which is a shame because that kind of takes me out of the story if I'm already kind of not following along, or I'm just thinking too hard about why it doesn't make sense. Which leads me to my next point. The science in this movie doesn't really make sense. I'm not exactly a physics expert, but when I was watching this, there's just some things that seemed really contradictory just about time in general, about things going in reverse but also going forward at the same time. That didn't really add up to me. And it turns out I did a little research. Yes, that's right. I did some physics research for a movie review. Anyway, there were two important takeaways from those videos. Number one, the second law of thermodynamics has a preference for the flow of time to only go forward. And number two was that reversing entropy does not reverse time. Now, I didn't know these things offhand when I watched the movie because I'm a moron and I had to research them. But I felt that something was off, so the fact that my limited science intuition told me something was wrong, that's the only reason I bothered to research this any further. Another problem this movie had: a tale of two movies. A friend of mine had mentioned that he felt like Tenet was an amalgamation of two different movies, and I couldn't help but agree with him after having seen the movie myself. Because on the one hand, it could have just been, a regular globe-trotting spy adventure. And then on the other hand, it could have been more focused on the science aspect and just been a science fiction movie. But the attempt to do both kind of made the movie feel overstuffed. An aspect that I thought was handled pretty well for the most part was the action. The action sequences across the board, I would say about 90% of them were actually really good. The best stuff was anything involving car chases. By far, that had the best looking and best shot stuff, and the best execution. The hand-to-hand stuff was also pretty good, though there's a little bit of a preference to the medium and close-ups, but it was still coherent. It's not the ultra-fast cutting close and medium shots that tend to ruin a lot of modern fight scenes. The shootout stuff was a mixed bag, though again I'd say the vast majority of it was fine. But there's one, and I won't spoil which, that just really sucked and lacked any sort of intensity or any sort of feeling of danger for the characters, and I'll get to that in spoilers. The acting all around was pretty good. I think the casting was fine. John David Washington was great as the protagonist, and Robert Pattinson would be the other standout performance. But the acting and the performances, that wasn't really my problem with the movie. But I guess, I will give it credit where it's due. Now I'm going to talk about the worst aspect of the movie, and that was the sound. More particularly, the sound mixing. My God. I couldn't understand what they're saying in crucial scenes. And with a movie where explanations are really, really key, that's just extra irksome that you have no idea what the hell they're saying. And one thing I heard was that some people were saying that In IMAX, you didn't have this problem and the sound mixing was much better, but for us regular folk who saw it on regular screens, I heard this from other people, and this happened for me included. There'd be parts where an engine is roaring too loud, or the music would be too loud, and you couldn't hear the person talking. Reminds me of that Family Guy bit, the interrupting trumpet. The point is, for a movie to be like Tenet, and to have this budget, the sound mixing being that bad is kind of inexcusable. Alright, now it's time for spoilers. Alright, so to start off, let's talk about that protagonist versus protagonist fight. Or, well, you learn that at the end, but whatever. Anyway, that fight is pretty good, and it's got some really interesting choreography, some good judo and that kind of stuff in it, some good throws and use of environment. But it's also kind of awkward because one guy's fighting forward and one guy's fighting backwards. And I found myself laughing at that part for some reason. It's really good action sequence. It's just awkward. Also, while we're on the subject of that, what happened to, you're not supposed to interact with yourself, otherwise the space-time continuum will collapse or some shit like that? I guess that just isn't a thing and that was just bullshit, so movie's just not following its own rules. For whatever reason, the same concept when it was done with the cars, in that scene where the cars just look like they're driving backwards, it just looked a lot less ridiculous for some reason. And by the way, that car sequence was by far the best part of the movie. It was excellently done, and the driving was really, really on point. So with the movie that had pretty much all good action scenes, you would figure the finale would be the best, save the best for last. But boy, was that not the case. It just looked like every generic war movie, but the only difference being one team's going backwards and one team's going forward. But they just kind of look like they're just shooting at nothing in particular. It just looks like they're going through the motions and there's no real severity to the situation. I was also not a big fan of the bad guy and his dumb family subplot and their yacht or whatever the hell. That was the subplot that overstayed its welcome the most and made the movie feel like it was dragging ass. See, this whole part with Elizabeth Debicki's character, it started off kind of interesting. Got this painting and all that spy jazz, but then eventually when it got to where it was going towards the third act, I'm just gonna be honest, I just kind of tuned out when they were talking. Those parts were boring. I just didn't give a shit at that point. I was checked out when they were doing all the yacht stuff. To be more specific of which part was the absolute worst, it would definitely be the big sailboat race or whatever the hell they're doing. It just felt like a travel video. I was half expecting voiceover to come on.
While you're enjoying your stay in southern Italy, why not go for a one-of-a-kind boat ride on these gigantic sailboats?
It's not a matter of how it was shot or anything like that. It was just a matter of story. Did this scene really feel necessary? Couldn't they have done this in a faster way, to set up that the protagonist, was given a life debt or whatever for saving the husband? I don't know. It just seemed a bit drawn out. For me, that whole sequence was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Also, let's review. We got this guy who's a spy after this doomsday device, and that's led him to southern Italy to chase this bad guy. Oh, by the way, there's also time stuff. You can invert time with people and objects and whatnot. And now we're on this boat. Also, they can hatch this dumb plan for the wife to almost drown him, but then the protagonist says, "No, I'll save you," and then, I owe you a life debt now, the bad guy says, and it's like, okay. It was at that point where I realized that this has too many things going on. Real talk, though, what if a shark just ate the bad guy? I mean, it could have happened. They were in the ocean. That's how I'd write it. Then you'd have a whole new twist. So there's time inversion, and then they have to use the time inversion to tell him to not get eaten by a shark, and it just adds another additional hour to the movie. I mean, what's one more subplot at that point, right? I mean, based on the movie's trajectory at that point. But eventually, after a bunch of horsing around and sharking around, or lack thereofing, the protagonist was the mastermind of the mission's success all along. It's all thanks to him and himself. He did it because something about being from the future, and Robert Pattinson's character couldn't tell him, or whatever. He says, we're friends in the future, and you're the guy who recruited me. I mean, I'll be fair, like, it is a clever ending, I guess, but it wasn't worth it based on the journey it took to get to that point. And I guess had it been, then maybe it would have been a more impactful conclusion. Well, to wrap this up, here's the conclusion. All in all, Tenet had some strong concepts and some other not as strong concepts, and maybe they just didn't all belong together. And for the ones that didn't work or that I had trouble following, perhaps, if you could actually hear their explanations and there was, audible dialogue, for one thing, then maybe those concepts would have worked better. And who knows, maybe it was better in IMAX, but to me that's kind of a cop-out, because, okay, great, I didn't see it in IMAX, so that is not a factor in my case. If you're going to release a movie, it should sound good in any theater virtually. Also, to reiterate for the parts that were harder to follow, I couldn't just turn my brain off, as they say, and kind of treat this as a dumb action movie and view it in that lens, because it was trying to use real science, so that to me seems like an attempt to be a kind of East meets West, where it's entertainment, but it's also kind of, trying to be a thinking man's movie. And Nolan's usually really good at making those kinds of movies that manage to do both. This time around, however, I didn't really feel like it was such a tightly crafted story, and as a blockbuster, sure, it had some moments, but that wasn't enough to carry the whole movie. The general idea of the premise is workable, going backwards to slowly solve the mystery piece by piece, and that's kind of interesting. He's kind of done that with Memento. But by the time the third act rolled around, there's just too much shit going on, and also there's just a lot of boring scenes by that point. And so some shit exploded, some time paradox stuff happened, and the protagonist saved the day. In the end, it just felt severely lacking. So I really wanted to like this movie, but I just couldn't fight the fact that I kind of hated it, despite some good action scenes. So my final score for Tenet is 2 out of 5. But remember, that's just my opinion, and I'm just one asshole, and there's many people who completely disagree with me. But I really thought more people were going to be on my side with this, but I guess not. Oh well. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Bonus Features podcast. If you'd like to hear more and keep up to date with all the updates and new reviews, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, see ya.